Specifically, though, I want to call out, they spent a large portion of that time as the lead lawyer for our data center group at Intel, which oversaw the direction of where cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and high performance computing were going, and the advances that were made in healthcare by the use of those technologies. So Matt is the ideal person to bring in for this particular conversation. And with that, I'm going to let Matt take it away. What we're going to do is Matt is going to deliver his lecture, and then we will open up for questions. I'll ask people to either put your question in the chat or raise your hand in the Zoom tool, and then we can unmute you and call on you. Matt, with that, thank you again, and go ahead.
David, thanks so much. It really is an honor to be asked to join you all, and just to kind of return a couple of David's kind words. David is a longtime friend and really a respected, trusted colleague of mine, and I have always appreciated how incredibly generous David is with everything, but most particularly with his insight and his wisdom. And so y'all are very lucky to be able to work with him, and I miss being able to work with him on a daily basis. So I'm just really excited to be able to come and do this. So thanks again for asking me to come and do this, David. So, a lawyer from Intel is here to talk about healthcare and artificial intelligence, and how did I come to be here, and why did a 20-year chip head lawyer suddenly jump into the healthcare field? There's a lot more reason to the madness than you might expect, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Just to kind of give you a sense of how I got where I am, the way in which my thinking and background about this developed, and hopefully that'll help to illuminate the discussion that we can have about policy and the ways in which I think we really can hopefully have our cake and eat it too, with respect to the security and ethics of people's data and the availability of that data to researchers and companies and government agencies, et cetera, that really can make productive use of it for healthcare and saving people's lives and the quality of their lives. So with that kind of a preview, I will talk a little bit about me. I promise not to lean too heavily into the Lord of the Rings analogy here, but the there and back again really did kind of speak to me a little bit about where I've been and how I came back to be back here in the healthcare field and working at a healthcare device and data company. So as David mentioned, I started my educational or my higher educational career and got into these fields at Stanford in the human biology department. And human biology is a great major. It's really a great program at Stanford. It's got a deep hardcore bio core, and then it brings in modules of pretty much every social science and relates it back to the interactions between human biology and sociology, psychology, economics, anthropology, etc. And when I was there, it was really at the dawn of really serious looks at human genetic research and other elements of kind of what we think of today as sort of advanced medicine. And I really got drawn in to questions of healthcare policy and medical and bioethics. And that every time I turned around, right, as I was studying those things, I hit a legal question, right? And so I'll talk a little bit more later about some of the things that I studied in specific and thought about in specific that really inform my thinking today still about the way in which we think about data and data access. But that is a short version of the reason that a bio major ended up in law school. And so, as David mentioned, I went on to law school from Stanford, down the coast to UCLA. At UCLA, there was a couple of professors there that were doing a lot of work around some pretty interesting things like property rights in the human body, and studies about possible policy considerations of this sort of increasing access to data about people's bodies, the interactions between their genes and other conditions, and the ways in which that data could be used both to help people and also obviously to people's detriment, and ways to try to balance that. And I was, privileged and able to do some work there on those things. But as often happens when you move from one environment into another, your interests that brought you there also broaden out. I got pretty interested in civil rights, and more broadly, I got interested in various aspects of intellectual property. As David mentioned, I went and clerked for a federal judge, and that gave me a different set of exposures. And I ended up in private practice doing intellectual property litigation, mostly not in the biology field. However, I was able to continue to do some medical privacy work, some of it with the ACLU, and in that space. And I got a broader exposure in technology law. Again, a through line where I kind of kept coming back to some of those baseline interests that had brought me into this field, but a whole broader set of experiences and a skill set around litigation that I needed to develop and work through. And most of the work I did, right, wasn't directly related to medicine or healthcare. So the technology exposure there in intellectual property, moving into some technology transactional work, and I wound up right after the dot-com boom, literally the summer after the dot-com boom. That's for a lot of you, that's sort of ancient history, but imagine landing at a financial institution in January 1, 2009, and you kind of have a picture of sort of the environment that I started with. It started in at Intel, it was again an entirely different environment. Talking about silicon chips, a whole different set of intellectual property, a different set of transactions. We've got the overlay of a whole bunch of different regulatory environments, including antitrust and competition law, international trade, but also, and this, again, kudos to David, who was one of the people who was most forward-looking, looking at data privacy, privacy law more broadly, and the ways in which it would impact our business. But that was a big element of many of our work, the work of many of us at Intel over that time. As David mentioned, and again, I'm going to talk specifically about genetics and a through line that came through my career and that really led me to where I am today in a moment. But one of the pieces that really I was able to work on at Intel was Intel's involvement in the advancement of genetic science in particular, and healthcare research more particularly. And Intel actually made a pretty big investment in that over this time. And I was, again, my interest, my through line of interest, my ability to reach out and become involved in that, and then also, some luck, right, in terms of being in the right place at the right time and being ready to reach out and grab it, meant that I was able to really play a role both in the legal side of that and in the strategy side of it for the business, which was super exciting. And then again, through a series of of fortunate happenstances, including the fact that one of my longtime, really wonderful clients at Intel, who had left a couple of years before I did, a woman by the name of Diane Bryant, who is just a really, a storied leader in Silicon Valley, had taken over a company called NovaSignal. And talking to her about what NovaSignal was doing and where she wanted to take it, it was really like a dream come true for me, because it really is almost a perfect intersection of the reason that I came into my career as a lawyer in the first place, and then 20 or 25 years of experience that gave me a skill set and an understanding of the way compute works, the way big data works, the way cloud computing is advancing, and a number of other factors that hopefully will allow us to really scale some pretty amazing capabilities at this company. Suffice it to say, without too many spoilers, right? Those really involve at every turn the application of artificial intelligence to some of the stickiest and most ubiquitous problems of brain health that exist in across the country and across the world today. And if we're successful, I think we can really do some amazing good. We have to be able to continue to advance the AI applications that we've started in order to do that. And so that's just a short version of what seems like it may be a very convoluted, in some ways it is, journey for me, but how I kind of started out in this field, went through a series of steps, and ended up in some ways, down the road back in a place where that has always been sort of the core of my passion about law. And I feel just super privileged in that. So this is just a short timeline of the last 30 or 40 years of human genetic science. Just a few highlights on it. And I want to use it as an example. It's one of the central examples of the early applications of big data and data science to human health. But it's ultimately, and the reason I'm using it as an example is it's one of 50 or 100 or 1,000 different threads of technology and biological markers, et cetera, that are all that all can come together and intersect in ways that can potentially allow us to really do some amazing good for human health over the next 10, 20, 30 years. But as with so many of these things, right, the early history of the application of genetic science to humanity and to human health is not particularly a pretty one, right? We all know, many of the very checkered, and downright, evil, actually, applications of eugenics early in the 20th century. But laying aside even kind of those broad-based pseudoscientific questions, when medical science first really began to identify some of the earliest, not kind of human genome level markers, but specific genetic markers for conditions, corporations and insurance companies and others picked up on some of those and began using them to screen out the carriers of those traits from jobs, from being able to buy insurance, and from other, from access to other privileges in society. And it would probably surprise nobody to learn that one of the most common traits that was screened for and that was used to exclude people because of quote unquote hypersusceptibility or other situations was sickle cell trait, right? This is in the 70s. And it was in retrospect, of course, and really at the time, even I think for people that were paying attention, right? It was a transparent marker, transparent for racial discrimination. But as fundamentally as that, and this is really one of the things that sort of led me into this field of study, and I'm focusing on it for that reason. It was using these measurements, using these traits that were immutable, that were part of the basic building blocks of humanity and evolution, to the detriment of the people whose traits they were, right? And expanding that out to a basic philosophical level, right? It's a fundamental perversion of the way in which evolution is supposed to work, right? You're using those traits, those genetic characteristics of a person to optimize somebody else's outcome to that person's detriment. And you don't need to go to that philosophical level to realize that it's not the right thing to do, and that it's wrong, and that it will have all kinds of detrimental and perverse effects across the healthcare system, et cetera, if you do it. But it really is, I think, at that level, something that we needed policy early on and on an ongoing basis to avoid. And as so often happens, the science gets out ahead of the regulation and the ethical thinking even. So, without getting into too many of the details of it, because it's really about the through line, right? In the early mid-late 80s, people started saying, hey, you know what, we could actually sequence the whole human genome. They did, to their credit, right, begin shortly after they started doing the actual sequencing project, start thinking about legal and ethical pieces of it. And then, about a dozen years later, right, in the early 2000s, they actually came out with the first fully sequenced human genome, $2.7 billion, right, and 100,000 hours of work later. And then, subsequent to that, right, and this is where I will say, I'm not going to take too much of the credit for it, but I will say that I was one of the people that was working on these ethical questions, right, through my undergrad. My thesis was about genetic privacy and the need to protect people from having their own genetic information used against them, while also preserving, and expanding the ability to use it in research, right? And ultimately, in 2008, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, essentially encoding those exact principles with respect to genetic information specifically, was passed at the federal level. And so there's a, again, there's that interaction there between this very fast advance of science and fortunately, at least here, parallel, not entirely trailing, direction of getting regulation and protective legislation in place to try to make that use ethical and beneficial. And then, previewing the next slide a little bit, over the next 10 or 12 years, right, that 100,000 hour time to sequence the first genome, as of late last year, is down to 1, right? We can sequence a single human genome in an hour. So how do we get there? So this is where, again, I was able to, to stay in the game, if you will, even though it wasn't necessarily essentially in the crosshairs of a lot of the work that I did with respect to healthcare and specifically genetic research. So while we were going from 100,000 hours per genome to 1 hour per genome, over this period of time, we were going from $100 million per genome down to under $1,000 per genome. And one of the things that, how did that happen, right? That didn't happen randomly. It wasn't just the inevitable march of progress. That's actually one of the things that has always been interesting to me about when you start to characterize something. Moore's law is shown on this slide, right? Moore's law is not a physical law, right? It is the result of thousands of hours, tens, hundreds of thousands of hours, and millions of dollars of investment from researchers and technicians and engineers, and the continuing push and collective effort of many, many humans, right? So the same thing is true here, right? There was just an incredible amount of research, but there were a couple of inflection points. This one here is one of the biggest inflection points, that you'll see. What happened there, right? The algorithms that were in use and the process of actually sequencing a genome had basically been standardized at that point. And this is where ubiquitously available, much cheaper high-performance computing became available. It was basically, we went from these giant monolithic supercomputers, which were very expensive, it could only be in research institutions and governments, to clusters of PCs, basically, that could do high-performance computing at a very cheap rate per unit. And I and my team at Intel, when we were thinking about how do we want to push this forward, one of the things we said was, when we cure cancer, we want it to be cured on Intel. And what's the most promising set of research to do that? It's genetic research. So we really leaned in at that point to getting high performance computing and these clustered supercomputers out there to the people who were doing this genetic research. And the result, in part, and we were part of this, right? I'm not going to try to take too much credit for it, but there's a lot of amazing researchers that did that work. We were part of this, and the result was what you see. And then here along the curve is where we started to invest in specific appliances to do that kind of sequencing. And then as we began to sequence more and more genomes, the amount of data out there started to really grow, and you had genetic data together with the outcomes of cancer patients. But it was balkanized in a whole bunch of different government and academic research institutes. And so again, we at Intel created a way in which you could keep that data behind the firewalls and allow each participating institution to run algorithms and do searches across all the data without it ever coming out of the firewalls. And that's what the collaborative cancer cloud, which is something called the cancer cloud, is kind of funny, but is. And it was a way in which we could try to ethically, and protecting both the institution's proprietary interest in their data and the patients, their individual patients' rights, make that data available to as many people as possible to advance the research. And so, this was not a huge proportion of the time that I spent working at Intel. I was the main lawyer for a giant business which had a lot of different considerations going on, but it was one of the pieces about which I was most passionate, and which the team that I worked with had a great interest in too. And it was really a privilege to be able to do that and to do that work. And I think we contributed to this curve. I'm not going to suggest at all that we were the cause of it, but it was a part of it. So a few years on, I already described how I kind of came to learn of NovaSignal and have this opportunity. But now, I move away from Intel and having the primary business be chips, to now I'm in a position where actually, the primary business of my company is to save people's lives and save people's brains with some very interesting and exciting new technology. And as you can see, you know, it's an intersection of an old diagnostic technology, which is ultrasound, and and robotics, right, and automated systems. But then really what holds it together and what's going to help us to advance it already has, and is going to hopefully really help us to accelerate, you know, from stroke where we are now, intracranial pressure, vasospasm, into TBI, concussion, migraine, dementia, any number of other brain conditions, is really the continuing march of a whole bunch of different artificial intelligence machine learning studies. So, you know, and NovaSignal is, just as Intel, right? NovaSignal is a for-profit company, as are, many of the companies that do this kind of research and, medical and pharmaceutical research more broadly, right? In a capitalist society, right, the way in which you scale a technology is you make it commercially successful. And so that is our aim, is to make this commercially successful. But I can tell you that the people who work there, and particularly the founder, who is a biomechanics PhD from UCLA, who, it's kind of funny also to come back full circle into my academic background, but the passion that they have for this work and for helping people with this work is really humbling, and it's a wonderful place to be. So that, it's kind of talking about the intersection of some advanced medical technology, right? The research, the early history of the company. Sorry, is there a question?
Hi, how are you?
Okay, I'm going to assume that was an accident. So, the early history of the company was the development of a robotic, automated transcranial Doppler ultrasound device. And this is actually what the device looks like. It's it's this headset with these two pods that both have ultrasound sensors in them, and transcranial Doppler basically is able to, using non-ionizing radiation, so there's no side effects of it. You can do it for as long as you need to. Is to go in through is to be on the surface of the skin, sense through a temporal window, and it can lock on to any of the major blood vessels in the brain, and get a lot of information about, real time, about the blood flow in the brain from that. And as they were working on developing this robotic capability, right, they were doing it with a sort of a traditional medical device perspective, meaning that it's a standalone device, it's got a cart, and it's literally air gapped from any kind of a data system. So as it collects all this data, it collects it, in a local hard drive, and then they generate a report from it. The diagnostician physician looks at it, determines what he or she needs to determine from it, and then after 20 or so exams, the data just gets erased off the bottom of the list in that air gap device. And so that's an, as we're going to think about, right, that's an obvious place where we can, and people like Diane and myself and others with a data perspective can come in and say, there's a big opportunity here for us to gather data and continue to advance the technology, right, that we're leaving on the table. The data that we obtained, that the company obtained early on to train these algorithms and set this up, was largely obtained from volunteers and in clinical studies, right, as opposed to kind of in the operation of the devices. So in the past year, as we are thinking about advancing this technology and turning it in from a standalone device into a data-centric, service-oriented company that can really accelerate the availability and use of this technology. And the first thing we do is we come in and we say, okay, we're going to connect this to an app, right? That is going to collect the data. It's going to be able to analyze it, deliver it remotely in real time to the physicians who need it. Store the data, compare a patient's exam to an earlier exam from that same patient, et cetera, and deliver additional value that way. Now, any of you who have thought about HIPAA, have thought about GDPR, have thought about the various things. There's a lot that you need to get through to be able to do that in a legal, ethical way. But fundamentally, the aim there is to use that data to benefit patients and to assist physicians in doing their work in diagnosing these conditions, right? And so that's really where we are today. And the next piece of that is using this cloud resident app and data to really supercharge our ability to gain insight and do analytics that hopefully are going to give us over the next several years a lot of additional efficacy and applications of how this data can apply to save people. I do want to talk a little bit about really the exciting things that we already know about what it can do. But let me talk first a little bit about how important, right, that data is to our ability to continue to advance this technology, right? I think the baseline of artificial intelligence, right, is that if you're going to train an algorithm, you need to have as much data as you can get your hands on against which that algorithm can learn. And if you're talking about thousands or hundreds of thousands of exams, right? Each one that you add has incremental value, and maybe the one that tips it over to becoming an efficacious diagnostic algorithm. The nature of this is such that the access to data sets is really everything with respect to the ability to advance the platform. When I talk a little bit about some of the somewhat far afield applications that it turns out that this kind of technology has that are not necessarily intuitive, you realize that you can learn things through the access to the data and through machine learning that you wouldn't even really necessarily back into other than by luck, right? And I think that's one of the really important things to think about and understand is that as we move forward into allowing access to this data in an ethical way, our ability to train and find candidate diagnostic algorithms against kind of a blue sky field of data is really, I think, what is going to lead us to a lot of the breakthroughs that are going to come in the next years on this. But only if that data is available to the researchers and the algorithms that are doing the work. And this is just sort of a representation of this. This slide is specific to one of the big value propositions that we have early on with our device, right? Transcranial Doppler ultrasound, the ability to measure blood flow in an artery in the brain, is something that's been around for a while, and expert, highly trained ultrasound technicians can do it today with a manual wand. But there are literally a few thousand of those people in the world, and they are expensive. They do not scale. And by the way, they are also subject to, like the rest of us, to being infected with infectious diseases. They can't, even the best of them can't hold a lock on an artery for hours at a time. So as you begin to automate those processes, right, and make that available to people with relatively minimal training, it expands the availability of this technology exponentially, right? And the more that you apply artificial intelligence to make that easy, automatic, and to increase the insight that you can get from it, the user base and the impact that it has expands a great deal. And then, of course, that also has then a positive spiral to it, because as you get it out there and you get more and more users and more patients and more data, and you're able to use that data, hopefully, cross-referenced with other diagnostic data sets, then those applications expand and become ever more interesting and broad and important. And so that really is the fundamental, golden cycle that we are trying to encourage here. So this is an example of one of the really interesting applications of this technology. So someone appears at an emergency room with the symptoms of stroke. Right now, today, the idea is to get them to, the standard of care is to get them to a CTA, a CAT scan, as quickly as possible, which is fine if you're at a major stroke center where they have a CAT scan, but they don't have a CAT scan device, a CTA, then it may be hours before you can do that. And that's what a CTA is going to allow you to do is actually do real-time imaging, right? And actually look at the brain and see where if there's a blockage. That's what an LVO is. Large vein occlusion is a blockage, usually a clot of one of the arteries or vessels in the brain. So enter our device. Our device is vastly cheaper, safer, easier to use than a CAT scan. And you can do it in an automatic way, right? You can lock on to the arteries, the middle cerebral arteries in particular, on both sides of the head, and you can get blood flow information that's coming through. And this is an example of what in someone with an LVO it might look like in the left versus the right real-time flow. You can see this information within minutes, sometimes seconds, after you put them in the device. And what the algorithms allow you to do, because they have spatial positioning, they have real-time blood flow information, they can compare the waveforms of the heartbeat one side to the other. It can not only tell you, yes, there is an LVO, it can actually tell you where it is in the brain because of the fluid dynamics characteristics and the way in which the blood flow works. And so it really is a major advance in the ability to diagnose and also find the location of the significant cause of stroke and death and brain damage for people across the population. Now, another example of how this same baseline operation could be really helpful is is during surgery, right? In certain surgeries, there is up to a 10% risk of a stroke during the surgery. Cardiac surgeries that involve a lot of potential, clotting is in particular. But stroke is one of the most serious potential side effects of any surgery. And one of the scary things about it is that if someone's under anesthesia, unless the stroke that they have, if they have a stroke, immediately affects their heartbeat or other vital signs, it may not be visible to anyone, right? The person's already unconscious. If you're monitoring that person, in a high-risk surgery with our device, you'll start to see this pattern, and you'll know within a few seconds that they've had a stroke, and then you can then treat them for it and avoid the brain damage that often occurs in conjunction with it. So, that's one example of what we can do with the technology. That one is a fairly intuitive example of what you might be able to find from examining the blood flow of arteries in the vein and in the brain, right? This one's a little bit more surprising. So there are a couple of serious conditions that result in what's called a right to left shunt in the circulatory system. One of them, and this is what this is about, is a pulmonary shunt, where there's a broken blood vessels in the lungs that result in some pooling of the blood and some exchange from the left to the right side of the circulatory system without the oxygenation of the blood in the process. Another one is what's called a patent foramen ovale, otherwise known as a hole in the heart. Every one of us has a hole in our heart when we're a fetus. For 3/4 of us, that closes entirely by the time we're born. For 25% of us, however, that hole between the left and the right side of our hearts remains. For most people, it's benign. For others, it can be larger, and it can ultimately result in that same kind of right-left exchange and some potential clotting. We've known this for a long time, but it's actually very difficult to find and diagnose. The heart's moving all the time. The PFO is usually closed by a flap, even in serious ones. And so it's difficult to find. But it turns out that you can, with our device, you can do a thing called a bubble study, where you put somebody in our device, you're looking at the left and the right side of their brain, real time, the blood coming through there. You agitate some saline, totally benign, and inject it into their left arm. And in a person without any kind of a shunt, you'll start to see bubbles come up the left side of their body, and it'll take quite a while for those to circulate through the heart, and so you start to see bubbles on the right side of the body, and then coming up through the right. If you start to see bubbles immediately, or within a couple of seconds on the right side, it means there's a shunt. The more bubbles you see, the bigger the shunt is. And it turns out that doing this study with our device allows you to detect the presence and size of a shunt far better than any other existing technology, including direct imaging of the heart itself. It's at up to 3 times as specific in finding and diagnosing them. Turns out that as we look at coronavirus and some of the more severe effects of coronavirus, folks were seeing a lot of strokes in severe cases of coronavirus. And we had a researcher who was doing research on PFOs with us who said, I wonder if there's a pulmonary shunt. And I can't study it manually because I can't have a technician in there next to a severe coronavirus patient for 45 minutes, but I can with this robot do this testing. And we were able to show that, in fact, particularly in patients who had been on respirators, there were a lot of pulmonary shunts in coronavirus patients. And that's something that really the existence of this robotic technology, together with the algorithms that could measure the bubble count and the blood flow content, really enabled us to discover. And this is earlier this year. It's actually we're doing further follow-up studies to see whether this ongoing damage to the lungs and shunting condition is, one of the things that is potentially associated with what's called COVID long haulers, right? Folks who have ongoing long-term side effects from COVID. So, it's an example of a thing that, who would think that, looking only at the blood flow of in the arteries in your brain, you could determine, whether there was a hole in your heart better than any other way that we have available to us today. And this is again a thing that there's the data, the existence of the algorithms, the existence of the algorithms guiding the robotic technology, and then analyzing the data. That's what allows us to find the existence of this connection and then use it to help people. So you can tell, I think, some of the reason why I'm excited about this technology and where it's going. What are our challenges, right? This is an overall set of challenges that are probably common to many medical device companies across the economy and across the healthcare system. But what's the one that we really are talking about here today and that we're super focused on, right? Data access is, it really is a direct correlation, how fast and how well we can bring online new capabilities that can save people's lives, save people's brains, is directly related to what data we can get, right? And while we do have the ability to access the operational data directly from our machines and use that, test the ongoing efficacy of our algorithms against that, that's really a small piece of what we need. And the access to the broader set of patient data is really the roadblock that we have. So, cerebral blood flow, we have a great data set with that. And kind of one of the characteristics of having access to this kind of data is that the more is better, but it is to some degree a diminishing linear return within a given data set. So, the first 1,000 is great, the next 1,000 is also valuable, but it's not quite as valuable as the first 1,000, et cetera, et cetera. Where you really get the advances is where you have correlated new data sets. So patient demographic data that's correlated to the cerebral blood flow, right? Each one of these lines that's going to be on this is actually a multiplicative value proposition, right? You begin to get exponential value from this. If you have some access to the patient medical history connected to the exam, right? Now those correlations are each a multiplicative value proposition with respect to how much insight you can get from it. Okay, diagnostic codes. What did this person ultimately, have? What was the diagnosis that was ultimately made? What was the diagnosis pre and post the exam? Et cetera. Right? There's each one of those correlated data sets that you can get is exceedingly valuable with respect to the ability to gain insight and ultimately develop these applications and use them to help people. So, obviously, right, there's a lot of issues with this. And we can all talk about the ways in which it's great to have data, but we also, I think, all know that there's risks and problems with having that data available to us, right? One of them is that data is better in a lot of ways that if it is broadly representative, and your sample sizes by gender, by race, by ethnicity, by age, by region, those are super important to the broad applicability of your technology and your ability to help the whole population. It's also, as we well know, super important with respect to the ethics of how you develop these technologies and how you apply them across a lot of traditionally underserved and unfairly excluded categories of the population, right? And without having those samples be ethically balanced and also ethically collected, right, you're going to have gaps and potential, either holes or even detriments to portions of the population. The sources of this data, there's a lot of challenges, right? Different types of regulation for different populations, for different geographies. Where you rely on voluntary participation, right? Either of institutions or patients, right? You can have, samples that are decreased or skewed by that. You can have economic incentives across the holders of the data, who know it's valuable, to hold on to it, right? To keep it for themselves, or to charge, really high rates for access to the data, even if they aren't able to make use of it themselves, and really a host of other factors that come into it, right? Other examples that come in, right? You've got kind of the ubiquity of phones and wearables, which can lead to great data sets, but also clear privacy concerns with respect to identifiable information. And broadly speaking, in a completely consent-based approach, right? You have really, both an under-inclusive and over-inclusive kind of thing that you get from it, right? You got individual distrust. People, who are concerned about these things may say no to the use of their data because of the perceived risk to them of doing that, because there's not transparency and not an understanding of where their data will go and whether it could ultimately be used to their detriment, right? And there are examples, think 23andMe and the use by law enforcement to track people down of possibilities where that kind of data actually has been used to people's detriment. Of course, the flip side of saying no because of the perceived risk is saying yes, as many people do, right? They click through we're all accustomed to click through the click to accepts and to do it in a healthcare setting, right? Do you want this, this to consent to this? And, we're going to do this life-saving diagnostic on you or your loved one. People are not exactly necessarily going to make informed choices at that point. And so if we don't have an ethical framework that makes sure that the data that comes into those systems is used in ways that will not harm people, then consent may actually be, the worst thing, because a lot of people will consent to that use and then without understanding what the broad implications of it are. So, where do we want to go, right? Think back to the beginning of my career and why I got involved in thinking about this field at all, right? I was looking at the way in which genetic information was being used. It's obvious benefits, right, across broad swaths of research and the possibility to do a lot of good for people, but it was immediately being used to harm the people it was being collected from. So I really believe that where you want to start is with a principled framework. You want to start with some top line principles that you're going to use to design your system, that you're going to agree on, you're going to aim towards. And we all agree that we want to use data to advance the common good. We all know that there's a lot of really positive things that we can gain from doing that. So we should on an incremental basis make more and more data usable for the betterment of patient health outcomes, right? And efficacy and efficiency in delivering healthcare. But there really is an absolute in this, and that is do no harm, right? I chose that obviously on purpose, right? Talking about healthcare, right? If you harken back to the Hippocratic Oath, right? Do no harm is really an important principle, and I think we can achieve that, right? I think we can say that we're going to design and architect both the regulation and technology to do this by on a do no harm principle, which means that no patient should ever be harmed by the use of the data generated from or pertaining to their body, right? And I think that if we can achieve that, right, and we can get people to understand that we're doing that in the way in which we're doing it, I think we're going to go a long way towards really settling out a lot of the problems that and the roadblocks that exist with respect to this use. And then you need to balance access and incentives across the data holders, right? We want to enable broad access to relevant data. We also we don't want to just make everything open source, right? We don't want to say that that no part of this can ever be proprietary, because if we do that, right, we're going to really materially disincentivize the investment that that is needed, right? This is all expensive work, right? To get to the place where we are really getting these insights and getting the benefit of those. Now, that last one, of course, has a lot of implications, right? And I'm not going to suggest that I think there's not going to be a lot of back and forth about how you do that. But as always, I think that you can begin to agree on maybe a common denominator and then move outward from there. So, Ma's proposal. In the healthcare system, you know, I think that that common denominator that we can start to work from, ubiquitous, de-identified, public, right? If you agree on a common set of data that you're going to take from each patient, right? And that everyone that comes into contact with a healthcare provider, and you're going to have that healthcare provider either collect it, and you're going to tokenize it using a secure encryption protocol, right? You're going to de-identify it, so you're going to have it's going to be identified to a token, to an individual, but not by that person's identifiable information, their name, or other things that can allow anybody to get back to who the individual is. And you're going to keep that data either in government or academic clearinghouses, or as harkening back to the collaborative cancer cloud at Intel, within the firewalls or secure cloud spaces of each institution that's collecting it, in a common structure and behind a common API, a public API, which will enable researchers to access that data to use the public token, right, to run their algorithms, run their research queries, right, across this data in ways that will allow the algorithms to be trained, or the aggregated research queries to come back, but never will allow you to back into the individual data or individual identity of any of the people whose data you collected. I think this is entirely possible, and I think that if we could get to this place, even for a very small category of these data sets, back to my multiplicative data structures, right, and data value, we're going to have created a huge amount of value entirely securely, right, with really fully implementing that do no harm principle across the whole healthcare ecosystem. And so that is my aim. That is where I would like to see us go. And with that,
Matt, thank you so much. And I know that we're going to have a lot of questions. I've been getting a bunch of questions that people have been sending to me in the chat. And so I want to ask, we've got a couple of ringers actually in the audience. So I want to warn you about that. One of our primary ringers is Campbell Tucker, who is an illustrious alum of Duke, both as an undergraduate and from law school, and as a vice president and global privacy officer or chief privacy officer of Novant Health. And so, Campbell, let me have you unmute, and you can ask your question.
Yeah, Matt, thank you for your time. And there's a whole lot of questions we could ask you in this, and take much more than the allotted time. But as you're getting towards the end of your presentation, one of the things that we are struggling with and would love insights as to how y'all are proceeding is that framework you presented at the very end of how do you wrestle with these questions about what's your framework around what are permitted uses of data where it's legally permissible, but it may or may not be an appropriate thing for the public good, appropriate for the community or society, may not be appropriate for an individual patient. And if it was possible to just sort of share an example of how y'all have wrestled with that type of question, I would find that really helpful. And I'll just sort of give you a little bit more, context.
Sure.
Novant Health is a regional health system largely in Western North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
We have just recently joined a platform led by an organization called Truveta, and which is a group of people coming out of Microsoft, where we are contributing data along with 14 other healthcare systems. And the intent is that it would be available, for the research purposes. It'll be there in a de-identified fashion. But we're just now beginning to explore, what is the data ethics policy around, what are the barriers around, what do we permit and what do we encourage in terms of uses of data. So I'd love to hear more about how y'all have developed your governance process and how y'all wrestle with those questions.
Yeah, for sure. So, so one of the things, so I know that group, I know who they are, and, for your information, right, the bones of the technical solution that they use is actually the technology that was developed at Intel and used in the collaborative cancer cloud. So, I mean, that I'm very familiar with what you're talking about, and I do understand then the question you're asking, which is, who gets to use the data and for what purposes, right? So you've got the de-identified data out there, and the idea with it is to make it usable for healthcare research. But what are the kind of the law of large numbers is that people will figure out all kinds of ways to use that data, right? I think that one of the fundamental principles that I would put out there on this is that by creating the structures in the way in which I'm proposing, in the way in which I think that group has created them, the possibility of research queries or research use of that data being used to come back to the harm of any given individual or set of individuals is actually quite low, right? Because of the fundamental technical limitations on the way in which the queries can be run, the algorithms can be trained, and the work can be done. Now, obviously, you can also, I think, the nature of an arrangement like that is that you can ensure that the institutions and researchers who have access to the data are vetted, right? That their purposes and their missions, right, are are consistent with the purposes for which the sharing arrangement was set up. I think those are the two biggest sets of ways in which you can hopefully be protective of that, right? You can ultimately, if you choose to, use an IRB type approach, where in order to gain access to the data, a researcher needs to actually present their query and their structure and their purpose, and then because it's got to be run through the API, right? You can actually audit that, right? You can actually observe whether it's actually being followed. Does that help a little bit? I mean, I think that there's all kinds of questions you can ask about whether a given purpose is productive or not, or is beneficial enough or not. But the fundamental thing I think that you're trying to do is to make it technically impossible or a vanishingly low risk for someone to use this in a way that actually isolates and identifies and is used to the harm of a given person.
And I appreciate that response. The challenge is, of course, going to be operationalizing the principles, and
Yeah.
that's what we are just now beginning to struggle with. But I'll let there's a lot of hands I see raised, and I'll let David move to those folks.
Okay.
Thank you, Matt.
But
Next question, Niharika.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm in Professor Hoffman's class, and during our last class on Tuesday, a lot of us talked about kind of how patient consent works with this technology when, for example, I'm not exactly giving up my data, I'm more giving up the ability to extract insights from that. And I know you mentioned like there is this trade-off, right? Like there might be distrust on one side, but on the other side, a lot of us, myself included, sometimes just kind of click through or just sign these papers because, I mean, like you're at the doctor's office, I mean, like you just kind of sign the papers because they're there.
Right.
How does the idea of like informed consent, so like legitimately informed patient consent, not just on paper, how does that fit into your framework of how to approach these technologies?
Yeah, and I think that my conception there is that, and of course this relies upon trust in our institutions, right, in a way which unfortunately, right, is at a fairly low ebb at this point. And I think a lot of us would like to see ways in which we could start to improve that. But I mean, my thinking about this is that you achieve that through technical and regulatory transparency at an aggregate level, right? More than trying to individually educate each person about all of the specific uses that their data would be put to, right? And so you have again, the fundamental idea here is that you're going to make it technically difficult or impossible to reverse engineer this to misuse an individual's data in this structure, right? And of course, all of us, rightly to varying degrees, have a real distrust in anybody that says that that's it's all a black box, right? And we have examples of a lot of places where the data was put to uses we didn't maybe expect or want. And so, I think that it does rely upon a regulatory scheme and then an underlying technical implementation and education about those things, right, that will ultimately give that trust. Maybe I'm being naive and maybe we won't be able to get there, but at the same time, I do think that I don't think we're going to get away from that fundamental click, 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 right? I mean, David and I were joking about it. We were talking about this, right? I mean, we are privacy lawyers, right? And we are the people who spend our lives doing this, and we regularly click through data use, terms and conditions without thinking about them, right? So I think fundamentally what that means is that if you really want safety, you need to do it in the structural way in which I'm talking about, right?
I think we're gonna come back to that too. That concept, a little bit of testing that. We've got a bunch more questions, so I'm not going to interrupt with one. I'm going to keep going. Professor Bundorf had a question.
Hi, I'm Kate Bundorf. I'm a new faculty member at Duke, and I have to say I really enjoyed your presentation. So many interesting things in there. I'm not sure which question to ask, so I'm going to ask you two. I've kind of narrowed it down. Okay. First of all, I want to draw a little bit on your experience as a privacy lawyer. So as you know, and I'm sure everyone on the call knows, we have this incredibly complex Byzantine system of regulation and privacy of health data in particular. And I wonder if you could point to places in which you think we're over-regulating and places in which you think we're under-regulating, right? So what are the, to get a sense of, we can make mistakes in both directions, and sure, based on your experience, can you point to those? And then I'm just going to give you my second question now and then turn off my mic. I also wanted to think a little bit about, in your ideal scenario of how we, kind of create these synergies through data collection. like, who owns the output of the research in that scenario? Is it the private company? Do we want those things to be public goods, you know, and how should we be thinking about that? Thank you.
Great questions. So, you know, as to the first one, right, I think that in the U.S., we have a you know, what I would characterize as a fairly incomplete set of data and data privacy regulations, right? And that could be good or bad in some circumstances. But you know, HIPAA was written at a time when, you know, EMRs were not ubiquitously used, and it's really a regulation that's written around paper records, right? And so I think a lot of the considerations around the amount of data and the speed and with which it can be exchanged and used, right, are just not adequately considered in the way in which the HIPAA is structured. I think, you know, an example of that is, you know, in business associate agreements, right? There's a common provision that allows a business associate to de-identify the data, right? That's a very common part of a business associate agreement under HIPAA. It's explicitly, you know, contemplated in the regs, right? You know, de-identified data is no longer PHI, and it is essentially not, the use of it is essentially not regulated by HIPAA at all. It's not, you know, it's not said what you can and what you can't do with it, right? And so once that data is de-identified, as allowed under BAA, you know, HIPAA's not telling the business associate what they can or can't do with it. So it's really up to the private contract between the service provider and, you know, whatever institution they're providing services to, whether there's any controls put over that at all, or you know, rights exchanged about it. But by default, if that provision's there, the business associate is essentially able to do what they want with that data. So I would call that a hole in our in our regulation, right? And on the flip side of that is, you know, GDPR and you know, the sort of what I would call sort of extreme implementations of individual rights to, you know, to the right to be forgotten, the right to, you know, essentially, you know, put a complete block on the use of a lot of different categories of data, which, as I think I've already expressed, right, is I think is probably not the right trade-off that we want to be making, right? If we can really, you know, keep people safe in the ways that I'm talking about, I think we want to make, you know, at least portions of this data available in ways that will be beneficial to them and everyone, right? But I mean, that's an ethical question we need to come to. You know, I'm sorry. Remind me in 5 seconds of that. I got into that answer, and your second question was a good one. So.
Ownership. Who
yeah.
Who owns? Yeah.
So
the results of the research. Yeah.
This gets to my balance. You know, the balance of access and incentives, right? And the idea here is that you're making this data available so that researchers, whether they are, you know, academic or government or private, can you know, create value from the data, right? And right now, a lot of this data just sleeps. It sits there and is not used by anyone, right, to create value. So fundamentally, you know, and I of course am coming from a for-profit, you know, medical device company, right? And I have that background, and I think that in those instances, right, the idea would be that the insights that are gained from that are the result of the you know, the investment and the work of, you know, whoever it is that's doing the research, right? And so at least as a, you know, you could do it on a permanent basis, or you could create a time-based system where you say, you know, if this is a big public structure, right, you have a time period during which you have exclusive access to the insights that are gained, right? And then, you know, after that period of time, it you know, your access to this data, one of the exchanges you make is that those insights become public. Another thing in the medical field that does kind of mitigate the proprietary, aspects of it is that the dovetailing of this with the way in which the FDA is thinking about how it's going to regulate software as medical device and AI, right? And there's a fair amount of transparency that you need to have on that side of things, and just in the basic acceptance of the technologies by the medical community, that sort of mitigates the possibility that someone could go in, get an insight, and then keep it, secret, right? Because if they do that, it's not going to get FDA approval, and it's not going to get adopted by the medical community. Right.
Thanks, Matt. I want to bring in another one of the students for the next question. Shreyas.
Hi, so I had a different question, but I was really interested in when you mentioned that the GDPR is on the extreme end. So you mentioned that in your ideal equilibrium, you'd want to keep some portions of data in safe settings for the public record. But I guess, as you're well aware, some data that could be considered de-identified and private in the past can be recycled in the public view. Like new algorithms, AI might be able to look for unforeseen trends in the data and re-identify the person. Yep. As medical and technological progress continues. And I guess that ties back into the first question I had, which is under your program, you mentioned that it would be better to have a broadly representative data source. So if data can be de-identified eventually, and especially for communities that have experienced problems in the past from having their identities identified, such as minority communities, lower income communities, in that sense. So would forcing their data to continue to be publicly available actually harm those communities in the name of more representation in the data sample?
So again, that comes back to to one of my probably the most important of my top line principles, right? Which is the do no harm. It's a fantastic question, and it is ultimately a thorny one, right? I mean, the law of unintended consequences tells you that any technical solution is ultimately, as you say, not perfect or perfect forever, right? And so what I would say about this is two things, right? One is that do no harm principle has to be a dynamic principle. That, this is not a fire and forget solution, right? You're going to need to have governance and auditing and observation, and you're going to have to hold participants to those principles, right? In addition to architecting the system to make it very difficult to misuse the data in ways that would harm people, you also need to observe and take care that it's actually not happening, right? And also evolve the ways in which you do the data sharing and the data the APIs and the technical solutions as the baseline technology advances. As to the question about minority communities and others who rightfully have an elevated level of distrust, or there's actual experience of this kind of data being used to harm them. I gave the example of one of the reasons why I came into this at all, right, was the misuse of the data as a pretext for racial discrimination, right? I think it is, again, a balance, right? If you're observing my top line principle, right, I think that the possibility of doing it is low, right? And the fact that it is a public process with publicly observable results should mean that if someone does misuse it, right, they can't do it in a hidden way. But I do think that the flip side of this, the focus of research that tends to center, the majority populations, right, means that a lot of the healthcare interventions and healthcare solutions that we have are insufficiently optimized and adapted to those very populations that are underserved, precisely because their data isn't coming into the studies and the systems. right? And so I think that's, to me, again, back to my baseline proposal that and principle that I want to be able to make this data usable to help and save the lives and save the brains and save the other health elements of these people, of everybody, right? If you want to do that, you need to have everybody's data, right? And you need to go in that direction.
Yeah, and Matt, I just want to, before I go to another student for a question, I just want to emphasize a couple of things that you said there that I think are so incredibly important. Number one, that this unintended consequence, I think, of the fact that we don't have communities who are most distrustful contributing data that go into these algorithms, that it may have a disproportionate impact on those communities of them not being represented in the algorithms that are being created out of that and be used in healthcare. And I think if we think of that as an ethical issue, are we making the right ethical decision then? And what I hear you saying is by allowing people to opt out or instead of focusing our efforts on curing the trust problem.
Exactly. Right. Let's make the system trustworthy, and then turn our efforts to convincing the people that that's true. Right. I mean, I think that's the way to do this.
And what I hear you saying there, but I want to make sure that I'm not putting words in your mouth, is that's going to demand organizations and structures that hold entities accountable for having the systems in place to be able to protect them. So you and I've talked about situations that have happened in other areas where the right contracts are in place, but nobody's checking to see if the entity that they signed the contract with is actually in compliance with it. The contract, as you and I both know, having been transaction lawyers, the deal gets done, the contract gets put in a drawer or now an electronic drawer, nobody looks at it for 10 years, right? So, but that I think means that there needs to be a lot of enforcement resources with regulators who are making sure that organizations are behaving in an accountable way. And there I am putting words in your mouth, and I'm just wondering if you want to react to that.
I agree with you. I do agree with you, right? I think that again, the law of unintended consequences means that there will be people that take advantage of any technological structure you put in place, right? Or try to. And you do need to have ways of discovering that and holding them accountable and to the principles you've put in place. I do have some faith in the technological solutions. If you architect this system with these principles in mind from the very beginning, right? You make it transparent and you make it hard to misuse it, right? Right now, the system we have is Wild West, unregulated, right? Cambridge Analytica can happen because nobody thought about that, and nobody thought about setting up the data structures and data use, and data elements in a way that would make it hard. And so they did what they could, and people will do what they can.
Yep. Let's go to another student question. Hazifa.
Hey, so I know you talked a lot about how because of like the data sets that we're using or that companies are using to train a lot of these AIs, there's a lot of biases that are passed down. And so my question was, how do companies currently choose what data sets they actually use? Do they just like partner with health systems that are nearby and willing to cooperate and consent, or do they actually like go out and look for diverse data sets? And then how can we better like influence them to choose more diverse data sets?
Yeah. So that's a great question, and I think that one of the things that I didn't talk much about is sort of the landscape for data acquisition that exists right now, particularly for smaller early stage companies like ours, right? Which is, I mean, you're basically going to get the data where you can get it. That means, that's one of the reasons why, so many psychological studies, right, are focused on, college undergrads, right? It's because professors can get that data for free, right? I mean, right now, acquiring the kind of full record data that we're talking about, that I'm talking about, trying to be able to make more cheaply and broadly and ethically available is expensive, right? If we're going to design a clinical study that's going to include all of the elements of gender and racial and age and other representation that we're talking about, it's anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000 per patient, per record, for us to get that data. And the meaningful data set size that we need to have to work these algorithms is in the thousands, right? So right there, I mean, you're talking about a very significant barrier to us doing that. Now on the flip side, right, one of the early focuses that we had, and it turns out that the data took us a different place, right? But the company was looking at TBI, and so it put a device in a truck, right, in a van, and went to high school and college football games, right, and said, hey, we're studying TBI, right? Sign up and come in and get and have an exam so that you can contribute your data to this technology that's looking at concussion and traumatic brain injury, right? I mean, a lot of companies do exactly that kind of thing, but of course in that regard, right, you get who comes in the door, right? And so trying to create representative data sets in that way is very difficult. So basically, the way in which we do it right now is we pay for it, and that's really pretty much the only way to do it.
Matt, do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, of course.
Great. Harrison Grant.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for coming to speak to us tonight. Admittedly, just as kind of a precursor, I have my own selfish reasons for asking this question because the framework of it is something that I'm working through right now in a research project that I'm doing with Professor Hoffman. And the research project is about privacy and democracy. And one of the arms of the project kind of implicates this problem of information asymmetry. So a big tech company in my research, I won't guess who, but I won't tell you who, but you could guess. They are rolling out new technology, and implicit in that new technology is essentially this brand's proprietary definition of privacy. Because there's no comprehensive privacy legislation in the United States, they're allowed to do that, and then they can essentially gatekeep people in their ecosystem that don't agree and say, well, if you don't subscribe to our definition, you're out. You can't participate in all the benefits that we have.
Right.
On the flip side of that, you've got users that don't really understand the privacy definition or the long-term implications of it and what it's going to change in their day-to-day lives. And it's not like the changes that it's going to institute are massive, but certainly from a privacy perspective and from a convenience perspective in this case, they're relatively significant. So the question of information asymmetry leveled to this discussion is essentially this. When you've got a company like NovaSignal, where the kind of ethical and data privacy-based transactions are significant, where and how do you communicate with relatively uninformed patients or potential patients or their families or the general public about how to make these decisions?
So I'll answer the question you asked, which is about how NovaSignal does it today, and then I will broaden that out a little bit because I think the broader answer is important here. And I think that so how we do it today is based on the system that exists today, which, as I mentioned, the primary way in which we gather this usable data is through clinical studies. And clinical studies have institutional review boards that review their protocols, and then consent forms, right, where if somebody's going to participate in the study, there's a set of standards by which they are informed of what they're doing, what they're signing up for, and how their data will be used, right? So in terms of the communication, right, that is the way in which we do it today, because that's the gate to getting the data in the door that we need. Now, as I think is probably, you would probably imagine, based on the way in which I'm talking about this, the other thing that we do is we are implementing, our own, have implemented our own data use protocols and standards that follow these principles that I'm talking about, right? So, I mean, when we have basically a brand promise that we make to anybody whose data comes in our door about we're not gonna, misuse their data in ways that could come back to them that would harm them, and that our mission is going to be served, and our mission is to, to save people's lives and brains with the technology that we make, right? And we want to be able to be proud of that, right? We feel like that's a differentiator for us in this space, right? As to the broader question, right, of how do you address that information asymmetry, the answer is you can't, right? The answer is that there is always going to be that information asymmetry between the very sophisticated companies and institutions that are wanting to use the data and the individuals whose data they're trying to collect, right? And so that is why I focus on trying to create frameworks and fundamental, design principles around the way in which you're going to design these data structures and data use protocols that mean that people can enter them safely, right? Whether or not they understand them at the end of the day.
So Matt, I feel like we're just starting to get going, actually. And I want to, there are so many issues that we haven't even touched on. And that's my way of saying, boy, I'm really hoping that you're going to be open to a repeat visit and to come in. I think as NovaSignal's business develops, as the relationships between the health systems that are going to deploy the technology, the cloud service providers that you'll be partnering with to help deliver the cloud services, as the data sets from the many different areas that you're going to need to come together to get maximum value, is the number of decisions. I think this is something you and I know. I'm not sure a lot of people who haven't been in practice would know how many decisions there are around the business model that can be created based on where the liability is going to sit and what the different regulatory responsibilities are. And I feel like maybe sometime we can do a session maybe with students where we can sort through a bunch of those and talk about what those decisions would be, because this is just going to be a fascinating area for the next at least 10 to 20 years.
Absolutely, and David, I've really enjoyed this, and I would and the questions have been great, and I would love to continue the discussion. Absolutely, right. I mean, I think and what you described, right. I mean, real time every day at work. That's what I do, right. We make these strategic decisions about what our data operational models and our structure are going to be, precisely with reference to these regulatory structures and ethical principles and the goals that we have to try to meet. And it is it's hard, right? I mean, but it is very rewarding, right? It's a very interesting and exciting place to be.
Well, we were extremely excited to have you come and join for the lecture series. We do 2 of these, one focused really on national security issues in cyber and one on healthcare. I think the ability to have you come in and talk with us about the advances in healthcare is really a unique opportunity for us. So I just want to thank you so much for being willing to do this. And I am wholly hoping and expecting that there'll be a part 2. So thank you, and thanks everybody for attending.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.